My name is Linde Lunney, and I'm delighted to be here today as one of the speakers in the RDS Library Speaker Series to tell you on this occasion about the Dictionary of Irish Biography, which is one of the big projects in our Irish scholarship of certainly of the last 20 years. I worked on the DIB from its very beginning in 1983 until I retired in October 2018. And I'm especially pleased to be able to talk to you about it at the minute, at this precise moment, because the DIB has just recently come out from behind a paywall. And now it can be accessed by anybody, anywhere, at www.dib.ie. And all credit to my former colleagues who are still working on the project. They brought it about, the IT people in the Royal Irish Academy and Cambridge University Press all helped to bring it out from behind a paywall, and now anyone can use it for reference and for fun. And I have found a lot of fun over the years working on it, so I hope I can share some of that with you. The original publication was in 9 volumes of hard copy, and that dates from a publication date of 2009. Online access was possible to subscribers, and it was available in libraries and eventually in all Irish schools on the whole island. But now anybody can open any of the 10,649 articles and can do online searches at will. So I'll start off with a bit of background history. In the early 1980s, the Royal Irish Academy began to consider establishing a DIB. And on the screen, you can see Academy House, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. I started work in December 1983, and I was tasked with making lists of possible subjects who would be included in the finished dictionary. And I started the job by reading through the 19th century British Dictionary of National Biography, all 63 volumes of it. And I extracted names from that who had an Irish connection and who might be suitable for inclusion. I moved on to the various colonial dictionaries of biography, the Australians and the Canadians, and I suppose we could count the Americans as colonials at that date too. Then I did all the 1-volume compilations of biography. John Crone and Henry Boylan's very useful 1-volume works. Then I got Kate Newman's Dictionary of Ulster Biography, Brian Cleave on Irish writers, Rolf Lober on 17th century architects, and so on. And then I started reading runs of local history journals and historical monographs. All the original collecting and classifying of names was done in those far-off days manually, in my handwriting, on paper, because this was before the days of computers. And the paper slips were filed in shoeboxes until I ran out of shoeboxes, and then they were just piled up on the top of a very elderly table on the balcony of the library in the Royal Irish Academy. And there were several very annoying incidents when a whole sequence of paper slips, when I pushed them too far back on the table, disappeared down through a crack in the table and fluttered down onto the readers in the room below. I made thousands of paper slips before we got our first computer. The DIB project was actually computerized relatively early for a project in the humanities, certainly before most historical projects were computerized. And I remember the editor of the Australian Dictionary of Biography being most impressed when he visited us in 1986. Our first computer was an Apple IIc, which had no mouse and, even more crucially, no hard disk. all the files and the software were stored on literally floppy disks. For those of you with technical interests, its speed was 1 megahertz. It had 32K of ROM. It had a 9-inch monochrome green screen. It cost over £3,000. It's hard to believe how revolutionary it seemed then. It took a considerable time, over a year, to transfer thousands of records to a FileMaker database on the computer. But after that, we were able to search for records by subject area or date and so on. And so we established a huge and ever-growing database of possible names. We understood early on, immediately really, that there was no way that we could publish a dictionary that held everyone who had ever been important in Ireland. So we knew we'd be selecting representative, major names. But I still kept on collecting many, many names. I suppose I just got started on it and kept doing that. But the idea of the underlying database was that it would be a resource from which we would be able to pick out names once we had them in front of us. I mean, you can't think of somebody necessarily just sitting around a table and making a list, but you can pick a name from a list. So that was the idea, that it would be easier to edit a dictionary once there was a database. And it was constructed so that it contained quite a bit of information: birthplace of the subject, career details, dates. And crucially, from my point of view, we also recorded the names of other people who were related to that subject, who were also in the database. So we had also coding, which allowed us to use the database to record who we had asked to write an article and how far along the article was in terms of the production. So the database is still being added to, and it is potentially a very major historical resource for local history and genealogy, at least, if not for academic mainstream history as well, with 68,000 names at the last count. But it's not yet available outside the project. Time went on, new editors were appointed. We got James Maguire from UCD and his assistant James Quinn. And eventually we secured guaranteed support from the Higher Education Authority. And largely thanks to support from the then Taoiseach, the late Garrett Fitzgerald, we got more substantial financial support and signed up with Cambridge University Press. The problem of selection gets much more urgent when you are actually faced with drawing up the final list of names for inclusion in the authoritative, representative, historically relevant, comprehensive, and historically balanced compilation to represent Irish history down through the ages, through the lives of Irish people. And that was the not insignificant task that we had set ourselves. For a start, what constitutes Irishness? If we had adopted the rules that govern eligibility for an Irish passport, we would have had an unimaginable number, given that everybody in world history with an Irish grandparent would have been eligible. So it was decided that we would only look at people born in Ireland who had a career in Ireland, or who had been born in Ireland and had a major career outside Ireland, or the third category was born outside Ireland, but with an important career in Ireland. And crucially, everybody we wrote about had to be dead before the 31st of December 2003. So it is rather a doubtful honour to be included in the DIB. At an early stage, it was thought that we might make an exception for the very famous Irish Americans, like, for instance, John F. Kennedy. But since we didn't do that, we had more room for people who were born on the island. People of Irish descent who weren't born in Ireland, we leave them for the appropriate British, American, Canadian, Australian dictionaries to deal with. And the same thing we decided about famous people who had been more or less accidentally born in Ireland and who never looked back at Ireland. We didn't give them an entry. There are also famous figures who were not Irish, but who could be said to have affected Irish life or Irish history in some way or other. What would you do about Gladstone, for instance? Clearly, Gladstone affected Ireland very greatly, but Gladstone, we didn't give him an entry. He never held an office in Ireland, and he only visited Ireland once briefly. But we did include some people who were born outside Ireland and only visited Ireland very briefly. For instance, Oliver Cromwell did get an entry. Obviously, you want important people, but how important? Do you automatically include, for instance, all Roman Catholic bishops? And if you do that, then will you have to include all Church of Ireland bishops? And if you do that, what about moderators of the Presbyterian General Assembly? What about all MPs in the British Parliament? What about all TDs? Or on the other hand, do you try to find room for a 19th century dispensary doctor in Inishowen and Donegal who worked for 60 years delivering thousands of babies locally? In many cases, decisions were based on just the consideration that at some point, someone would pick up the dictionary and expect to find that particular person in the dictionary. Every name just about had to be examined on its own merit. Even kings and queens of England, who were all technically rulers of Ireland from the Middle Ages, did not get carte blanche wholesale entry. We only include Henry II, John, Richard II, James II, and William III. And of course, the list of names would be different if a different team ever set out to do a dictionary of Irish biography. I think there would be a very small number of people who would automatically and obviously and always get into a dictionary. But I think we'd be surprised how small that group is. And it would be very interesting if everyone listening to this wrote down the most important names that, in their view, I bet there would be overlap on only 2 or 3 names out of the many hundreds that might be suggested. But, of course, the project and the finished volumes got criticised because we did leave out people. And according to our critics, how could anyone overlook such a one, whoever they were supporting? Nearly every week, now that I'm retired, and even now that I'm retired, I send names to my successor in the project, people that I have come across and we missed out. Folk can get a bit carried away about the importance of their own family members or about someone they did their PhD on. And it was up to the editors to be as even-handed as they could while coping with pressure from colleagues and critics. And I will just note here that I might have been one of the colleagues because I was always looking for just a few more northern subjects to get in, especially people from County Antrim. But the DIB had to give all aspects of life and all different areas of Ireland a fair chance. And after the editors and specialist panels established lists of subjects, the names were allocated to authors to research and write the articles. And the somewhat more minor names went to the increasing number of usually young researchers that we were employing. And major names were allocated to people outside the project who were known to be expert, who had written full-length biographies or were, in general, were well acquainted with a period. Of 700 contributors, about 80 were employed on the project for various lengths of time. And I have written so far 781 articles. I took care to leave when I had written 777, but I've written a few since then, which rather spoils the symmetry of the figure. And that number is more than any other contributor, but possibly I have written fewer words than one or two of my colleagues who wrote at greater length in fewer articles. Articles vary from 200 words, where almost nothing is known about someone, up to 14,000, and that was for Eamon de Valera. For the hard copy publication in 2009, 700 contributors wrote 9,014 articles, covering 9,700 names. That was over 7,000 pages in 9 volumes. 8,361,484 words to be precise, with well over 40,000 cross-references between the subjects. And looking back on it, the process of pre-publication checking and editing is almost incredible. All those pages were read by the editors. Then they were all copy edited. Then they were read by expert readers outside the project, corrected if necessary, then sent to be typeset, sent back to the editorial team in-house for checking as galley proofs, sent back to the publisher, corrected. The corrections were returned to us as revises, checked, sent back. All the copy was returned as page proofs, checked, sent back, and finally, we ran our eyes over the very final version before it was sent off to be printed, bound, and then delivered back to us in boxes. And to use a baby and pregnancy metaphor, that was the labour and delivery, although it weighed a good deal more than most babies at 27 kilos. The amount that we could change and correct diminished at each stage of the editing process, and it was soul-destroying to discover errors at too late a stage to fix them. Not many errors, and only a handful of those are serious errors, but they do leap out at us. As errors were noticed, we tried to correct them, but of course, you can only now do that in the online version. The printed version, it's set in stone. I should remark here that we did not pay any of the external contributors. So the project, and indeed scholarly life in Ireland, owes them a great deal. They put up with being ordered about and edited and given deadlines without any remuneration. Now, the DIB has tried to represent contemporary developments in historiography by focusing on achievements rather than on position. In other words, we were more interested in people who had done something or been something in the general sense, rather than being a bishop or being a cabinet minister. Because we've done that, we can include, for example, considerably more women than the original English Dictionary of National Biography from the 19th century could have done, because they had the old-fashioned emphasis on office holders and politicians and churchmen. And because they had that kind of focus, you are inevitably limiting the number of women that you can include. Elizabeth Welsh, a farmer's daughter from Kirkcudbright, County Down, mistress of Girton College in Oxford from 1885. She didn't get into the original UK DNB. Not all masters of colleges did get into the DNB, and you'd have to admit that her scholarly publications weren't in the same league as those of, for instance, the very famous scholar Jowett of Balliol. But Elizabeth Welsh's achievement, I think we would argue nowadays, was possibly no less than Jowett's, and we have included her as a representative of an early generation of women scholars. And thinking about Elizabeth Welsh and the problem of representing women, the question of gender representation is an unavoidable weakness of the DIB, as it is of many or even most historical works and compilations. And it's quite interesting to compare our efforts with those of the original 19th century British DNB, and also with its modern successor, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, which first appeared in 2004, 5 years before the DIB appeared. The original old school DNB of the UK managed 3% of women subjects. The later ODNB managed 10%, and that was the percentage that we achieved also in the first 9 volumes of the DIB. We did improve somewhat with the updates which followed publication in hard copy. We did the updates online, and the more modern periods of history that we were covering, with women taking more of a role in public life, we got the number up. We got it up to 22% of women, and that was the figure for women subjects and the people who died between 1950 and 2017. And of course, that figure will continue to improve as we deal with more modern times. And I should mention here that nearly half the people included in the DIB were actually people who died after 1900. That's 4,934 people are in the DIB from more modern periods of Irish history, which of course includes the 100 years of Ireland's existence as a modern independent nation. The very minute that the online version appeared, people in the media, of course, immediately searched for and focused on a category that we had labeled as eccentrics. And that may have given the public a somewhat out of kilter impression of what the DIB was like. The media, especially the more popular reviews, commented on people like Jackie Barrett, who was a miserly and eccentric scholar who spent his life in the library of Trinity College, and who is said to have failed to recognize a sheep when he once ventured out to the countryside. He said he knew about mutton, but had no idea what it came from. We could, I suppose, have quoted a lot more people as eccentrics, but I suppose one man's eccentricity is another man's endearing little quirks. I think Francis Turnley, who lived from 1765 to 1845, who was from Cushendall in County Antrim, should have been coded as eccentric. But the person applying the coding missed him, because I was a bit soft on him and described him in the introduction as landlord and philanthropist. Turnley had planned to set up a system of ideal world government that was going to centre on Cushendall. There was going to be a watchtower to symbolise the operation of the watchfulness of reason, and it was going to ring curfew to keep the people of Cushendall and the world governors in a proper way of going to bed. There was going to be a clock circled with the illuminated word eternity to indicate that eternity encircles and casts light on the passage of ordinary time. Francis Turnley could be described as the first person to envisage the United Nations, but I'm afraid his will, in which he left all his money to set up a meeting of the nations, was set aside on the grounds of lunacy. So it's Geneva rather than Cushendall that hosts the UN. And another County Antrim man, there's quite a few County Antrim people in my examples, so you might understand why. Another one who got off lightly without being coded as eccentric was the famous John Carey, 1800 to 1891, who was a Presbyterian minister accused of attempted murder. He shot, or at least he is accused of shooting at a fellow minister who was preaching in the pulpit at the time. Carey was released and was not ever found guilty. He went on to make a lot of money by lending money at extortionate rates, a penny per shilling per day, which gave him a lot of revenue, and a lot of people's land came into his hands. But he did build a temple that he called a Temple of Liberty, Learning and Select Amusement to seat 1,500 people in Toom in County Antrim, where there are not 1,500 people to this day living. It had a library of 5,000 books and a pipe organ, but it was burned down in 1911 by people who were opposed to the whole concept of liberty, I suppose. This is his grave, which he designed himself. It has a railing made out of wrought iron human hands, which appear to be reaching up out of the grave, and a extract on the gravestone from Burke's Peerage. Carey thought he was descended from some of the aristocratic Carey families in Burke's Peerage. Turney and Carey just happened to be both from County Antrim, but they're examples of the endlessly fascinating so-called minor figures. Of course, there are lots of interesting details in the DIB about well-known, more celebrated people, and the facts and the assessments of the careers of the well-known people are very useful. But for me, many of the people we gave coverage to, the people we discovered, in fact, in general, should be much better known than they are. They are little known, but not of little importance. And as one example of that, I'm going to tell you about the life and career of a man called Samuel Craig. And in this particular year that we've all been through, the year of the pandemic, I think Craig's career is a tremendous object lesson in what can be achieved. He lived from 1816 to 1901. He was born near Derry, but he became minister of a small Presbyterian congregation in Summerhill, County Meath. There were only 14 families. And he found himself as the only local leader of attempts to help people to get through the Great Famine of the 1840s. He was secretary of the local famine relief committee, but he was one of the only ones that did any work. And for the next 12 months, he was solely responsible for all arrangements for distributing stirabout for about 1,000 people every day. He organised the kitchen with a boiler of 150 gallons, a ticket system for applicants, and a team of carters to draw meal and coal. When the cholera epidemic broke out in 1847, Craig set up a temporary fever hospital for 60 sufferers from cholera in outbuildings in the farmyard of a local nobleman. The local dispensary doctor was too frail or too afraid to attend the patients, so Craig examined them, helped to nurse them, comforted the dying, issued death certificates, and procured coffins. And while he was doing all of this crisis management, while he was in grave personal danger from famine fever, Craig was also frantically having to raise the necessary money to keep the whole thing going. And I think this is the kind of story that I'm particularly proud of having preserved in the dictionary. And you can discover stories like that through searches in the online version. You can find every example of every word that occurs in the 300 million words that there are in the dictionary. You can find dancers and dentists, and a man from County Antrim who studied dengue fever. You can find a woman who was born in 1731, and that's the year that the Dublin Society was founded. So that gives the suggestion that if you search for in the online essays in the DIB for the words RDS and Dublin Society, you might find something interesting, and indeed you do. You find about 450 occurrences of those words. And I want to point now to some of the very interesting parallels and connections between the members of the Dublin Society and indeed the larger society in which they operated. And to provide examples, I've chosen 3 sets of 3 people associated with the RDS. And you can look up the entries for yourselves. This is just a wave in their direction for today. The first set is of 3 members who fostered arboriculture, the growing of trees, which was always a very, and especially at the beginning, a very important aspect of the work of the Dublin Society. It was felt that Ireland's tree coverage needed to be much increased. Sir Samuel Hayes, who died in 1795, was an improving landlord who owned an estate in Wicklow that he renamed Avondale, and that was later inherited by the Parnell family, as in Charles Stewart Parnell, the famous politician. Hayes planted huge numbers of trees and wrote the first book published in Ireland on cultivating trees. The second example is John Rawdon, the first Earl of Moira, who died in 1793. He planted 100,000 trees on his County Down estate at Montalto, and it's been calculated that that was the equivalent of about £4 million sterling in today's money. And my third example is Joseph Doyle, who died in 1974. He was a botanist who campaigned tirelessly for 20 years for a state arboretum, and that was finally achieved in the John F. Kennedy Arboretum in Wexford. My second set of 3 women linked to RDS activities: Elizabeth Rawdon, the Countess of Moira, 1731 to 1808. She's the woman who was born in the year that the Dublin Society was founded. And I just mentioned John Rawdon of Montalto. Elizabeth married him. He had been, before the marriage, regarded as, in quotation marks, somewhat of a poltroon. But thanks to her skillful management of him, he became much more of an ornament to society, and in particular was particularly an ornament in the Dublin Society. The Countess herself was awarded a silver medal by the Dublin Society, ostensibly for her study of flax production, but I wonder if it was perhaps also for her management of her husband. Mary Ann Hutton, 1862 to 1953, was a wealthy supporter of the Gaelic Lead and an Irish language enthusiast. She was crucial to Patrick Pearse's efforts to keep his school going, and years later, she represented the RDS at the Celtic Congress in Edinburgh in 1937. Lady Arabella Denny, who lived from 1707 to 92, was an important philanthropist who more or less ran the Dublin Foundling Hospital and the Magdalen Asylum on Leeson Street. In 1767, the minutes of the Dublin Society record her giving premiums to deserving children in the Foundling Hospital who had excelled in lace making, and later she advised the Society on woolen and worsted manufacture. She was a keen promoter of Irish industry. She introduced carpet weaving to Ireland in 1761, and apparently she bred silkworms in her house in Black Rock. And I think that deserves a blue plaque if nothing else does. My third set is actually not 3 people, it's actually 4 people, because I found 4 who fitted the terms that I was looking for. And this is RDS members to represent the good, the bad, and the ugly, as in the title of my talk today. It is not difficult, I am glad to say, to find good people in the DIB articles on RDS members. But as an example of large-scale philanthropy, we should consider Thomas Pleasance, who is said to have given £100,000 in contemporary values to Dublin institutions and to charity. He spent £13,000 on the Stove Tenter House in the Liberties. And that was somewhere that the woolen weavers who thronged the Liberties could stretch their fabric after it had been soaked in water. They could stretch their fabric in the big rooms of this house to dry in the winter. You can imagine that the wee houses in the Liberties, there wasn't room for big woolen webs to be stretched, and they couldn't afford the firing to keep the place warm. Pleasance also gave £700 to the Dublin Society to build 2 porter lodges at the gates of the Society's Botanic Garden in Glasnevin. And by his will, his own house on Camden Street became a home for orphan girls. And Pleasant Street off Camden Street is named in his honour. And I hadn't realised that until I looked him up to give this talk today. And it's charming to read that he left explicit instructions in his will about how a beloved jessamine or jasmine plant in his garden should be looked after he died. He wanted to make sure that it also survived. It was actually difficult to find a bad member of the RDS, but I found a couple eventually. The first one is Alexander Montgomery, who was known as Black Montgomery. He lived from 1720 to 1800, and in later life he became MP for Donegal. But as a young man, he was a soldier in the British Army in Canada and is said to have killed his commanding officer in a duel, and he cruelly mistreated Native American prisoners. It is said that he was unpredictable with wild impulses. He was implacably opposed to Catholic emancipation, and he had a violent falling out over an election with Sir Samuel Hayes of Avondale that I mentioned just now, who had the Avondale estate. And Hayes, of course, was a fellow member of the RDS, but that didn't stop Montgomery challenging his colleague. And although he was 77, he challenged Hayes to a duel, shot him twice in the leg, and would have kept on firing, but for the seconds in the duel who implored him to stop. There was another bad member, a man called John Stratford, who was one of the founders of the society, but apparently cut down thousands of trees on his estate rather than planting them. So that's the good and the bad. What about the ugly? Obviously, ugly members of the RDS are just as rare as bad ones. But poor Andrew Caldwell, 1733 to 1808, is described in the sources as exceptionally ugly. Despite his unfortunate physiognomy, there are interesting aspects to Caldwell's life and career, which point to some more of the kinds of connections that I love to look for. And I think especially now that I am retired and out with the discipline of proper academic study, I find myself following these kind of connections more and more. Caldwell was one of the commissioners charged with planning the town of New Geneva in Waterford. And believe it or not, this was a settlement that was to be offered to disaffected Swiss people who were going to emigrate after a failed revolution in Geneva. Unfortunately, New Geneva, like the Swiss Revolution, was also a failure, as was another planned settlement connected to the RDS. This was established as a linen manufacturing base. The town of Stratford-on-Slaney was established by no less a person than the Dublin Society founding member, John Stratford. So that's why it was Stratford-on-Slaney. And this is the entrance to a mill building that was designed to be a linen manufactory in that now failed settlement. And here we go on one of the chases for connections that I find myself particularly prone to. I am struck by the coincidences that involve these planned towns. New Geneva and Stratford-on-Slaney, founded with high hopes of economic progress, and these characterized the 18th century, especially the early century, the couple of decades just before the Dublin Society was founded. There are so many different projects promising the easy acquisition of vast riches, especially across the Atlantic. And for some reason, the Scots seem to have been particularly prone. Almost anyone who had any money in Scotland invested heavily in the Darien scheme of the late 1690s that led to 20% of all of Scotland's capital being capital money rather than capital city. Capital money being poured into a ruinous project to set up a trading colony called Caledonia on the Isthmus of Panama. Also in the late 1690s, Scottish and Ulster merchants were trying to build up trade with Suriname, of all places, on the Atlantic coast of South America, and they established settlements in the jungle in 1690s. In that same period, responding likewise to the zeitgeist, the Jesuits were setting up what they called missions, but which were effectively theocratic communities in the jungles of Paraguay. The Scotch-born economist John Law almost ruined France when a land company that he set up to exploit Mississippi led to feverish speculation and eventually in 1720 to the bursting of the Mississippi bubble. There was another bubble, the better known South Sea bubble, and that also burst in 1720. George Barkley, the philosopher who was a close friend of Thomas Prior, the founder of the Dublin Society, hoped to get a government grant to help him found a university in Bermuda. He traveled to America to try to establish his college in the very year that the Dublin Society was founded. These schemes and these hopes and others that you could document, they must have flavored the water that the founders of the Dublin Society were imbibing. The concept of improving what nature has given was so fundamental to thought at the time. I could go on about this theme. I'm sure there's other things to say, but I want to mention a couple of other topics before I finish today. When I started for this talk to research the founders of the Dublin Society, I noticed something which hadn't struck me before. Probably people who have looked at it have noticed it, but it particularly struck me. And it's another triad, another three figures. Three of the founders were from County Antrim, and with more or less Presbyterianism in their backgrounds. Dr. Alexander McNaughton, Thomas Upton, and Arthur Dobbs were all members of the County Antrim gentry. County Antrim gentry at that period, and indeed since, are all related. And I'm certain that these men knew each other well before they would have met in Dublin. And there must have been a network which brought them together in Dublin as well. But for instance, Arthur Dobbs was High Sheriff of County Antrim the year after Thomas Upton's brother. So they were all related through other. Historians might like to address the question of how much the spirit of improvement in Ireland, and in particular the foundation of the Dublin Society, might owe to Presbyterianism, to the Scottish Enlightenment, and to the rather harebrained economic schemes with which so many Scots became entangled in the period. For instance, Arthur Dobbs, who was one of the founders, one of the County Antrim men, he campaigned for years to get funding for 2 expeditions to find a northwest passage to India through the top of Canada. And he ended his career as governor of North Carolina, where he got his hands on, sources differ. So one source says 400,000 acres, and another source says 1,300,000 acres of not very exploitable forested land in North Carolina. So he also was affected by the bug of making money through exploiting natural resources far away. Using the online DNB to look for these connections, you can also do it. You can use the DIB to look at the connections between, for example, the Dublin Society members and other figures in the society of the day, just in the general world. With more time, I could tell you how Arthur Dobbs is related to Francis Turnley of Cushendall, the man who tried to establish world government there. Dr. Alexander McNaughton is a close relation. I think he was an uncle of a famous man called Half-Hanged McNaughton, who was fully hanged for murder. And you can find different kinds of connection as well as just the kinship, the relationship. You can find, for instance, between the 2 founders, Robert Marshall and John Stratford. They were school fellows in Kilkenny College in 1711. So that's the kind of thing that you can find by dipping into the articles in the DIB and having fun with the connections and the cross references. You can easily waste a morning just by following up some of the words that might interest you. Go and look for all the dentists or all the dancers. But I'll leave you today with a recommendation that you could go and look at an online project called 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon, which was originally based on searches in the ODNB, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography in Britain. And it sets out to map and graphically represent the social network of the early modern period in the Western world. And I have just realized I can't move a cursor over this. But if I could, if it was a live page from the site, you can click on all those wee dots, the wee round dots, and those take you to the biographies in the Dictionary of National Biography, the British one. And you can read the biographies and you can follow the connections through the network. And I've put up here William Molyneux, and this is the network that involves William Molyneux, who was one of the Dublin Society founders. And it shows you the people that he had most in common with and the people whose career connections are just peripheral to him. But it's a fascinating way to represent the kinship, the links which held that society together. The RDS, the Dublin Society, and the Royal Dublin Society, I would say, seems tailor-made for such a project, using online resources and especially the DIB. And it would be such fun to populate a similar model of links and influence and kinship as represented in the Dublin Society. And I would say that links and influence and kinship are the foundations of the human society as well as of the Dublin Society. And finding and recording those links in the DIB has made my career so very interesting and fulfilling.